June 15, 1996. Beverly Hills. In a quiet room far from any stage, Ella Fitzgerald, the woman once called the First Lady of Song, takes her final breath in silence. The voice that transformed jazz into a global language that filled Carnegie Hall with crystal-clear notes dies not in triumph before applauding crowds, but in the solitude of a room where diabetes has already stolen her legs, her sight, and finally, her voice itself. The woman who spent her entire life singing to fill the loneliness of her orphaned childhood, who used that voice to make the whole world feel less alone, dies in the very isolation she spent decades trying to escape. No audience, no applause, only the echo of all the love songs she gave to others but could never quite keep for herself. How does a frightened 17-year-old trembling as she steps onto the Apollo Theater stage planning to tap dance but changing her mind to sing instead become the definition of American jazz? And how does someone beloved by all humanity through her voice still die feeling she was never truly loved herself? "As long as I can sing, I can live," she once said with the certainty of someone who had found her only reliable salvation. But in the end, even that betrayed her, leaving behind only the cruel mathematics of her legacy. A woman who made the entire world feel less lonely, except for herself. Newport News, Virginia, 1917. Ella Jane Fitzgerald is born into a world that doesn't want her, to parents who can't keep her, in circumstances that will shape everything about how she understands love, loss, and the desperate need to be heard. Her father, William Fitzgerald, disappears early, leaving behind only his surname and the particular kind of abandonment that creates both resilience and lifelong hunger for acceptance. Her mother, Temperance "Tempy" Williams, works as a laundress and part-time numbers runner, struggling to provide stability in an inherently unstable world. Tempy is a survivor, someone who's learned to navigate racism, poverty, and single motherhood with a combination of pragmatism and fierce protective love. But she's also someone who understands that love alone isn't enough to change the circumstances that poverty and prejudice create. When Ella is still young, the family moves to Yonkers, New York, seeking better opportunities and escaping the suffocating segregation of the South. It's a migration that mirrors the great migration of millions of African Americans seeking freedom and opportunity in the North. Though freedom proves more complicated than geography can solve. Yonkers offers more opportunities, but also new forms of exclusion. Subtler but no less effective methods of making it clear where Ella and her family belong and don't belong. Tempy eventually partners with Joseph da Silva, a Portuguese immigrant who becomes the closest thing to a father figure Ella will know. Joseph is kind but struggling with his own challenges. Alcoholism, the pressure of providing for a family that isn't biologically his, the particular stress of being an immigrant in a country that barely tolerates its own marginalized citizens. The household is loving but precarious, held together by Tempy's determination and everyone's shared understanding that security is temporary, that everything they have could disappear without warning. This instability teaches Ella crucial survival skills: how to read adults' moods, how to make herself useful without being demanding, how to find comfort in small pleasures rather than expecting grand gestures. Most importantly, she learns that safety comes from being appreciated rather than loved, that acceptance must be earned through performance rather than simply received through existence. At school, Ella discovers she has a good voice, not great yet, but good enough to earn praise from teachers and classmates. Singing becomes her first reliable source of positive attention, the one thing she can do that consistently generates the approval she craves. She joins the Glee Club, practices in church choirs, performs in school productions with the dedication of someone who understands intuitively that this might be her ticket to something better. But the stability of her Yonkers childhood proves as fragile as everything else in her young life. In 1932, when Ella is 15, Tempe dies suddenly from a heart attack, leaving behind a teenage daughter who has never learned to trust that good things last, who now has devastating proof that they don't. Joseph tries to maintain the household, but his own struggles with alcohol and grief make him an unreliable guardian for a traumatized teenager. Ella is sent to live with her aunt in Harlem, but that arrangement collapses when family tensions and financial pressures make her presence more burden than blessing. By 1934, she's effectively homeless, sleeping in friends' apartments when possible, in doorways and subway stations when necessary. She's 17 years old, functionally orphaned, living in the most vibrant African-American neighborhood in the world, but feeling completely alone. The Apollo Theater Amateur Night on November 21, 1934, represents both desperation and opportunity. Ella enters the competition planning to tap dance. She's been practicing, knows she's adequate, hopes that adequate might be enough to win the $25 first prize that could buy her food and shelter for several weeks. But standing in the wings, watching the previous contestants, she realizes that several other dancers are significantly more skilled than she is, that her adequate tap routine will look pathetic in comparison. In that moment of panic, she makes a decision that will change not just her life but the entire trajectory of American music. Instead of dancing, she'll sing. She's never performed solo in front of a professional audience, has no experience with the kind of jazz standards that Apollo crowds expect, but she knows she can carry a tune, knows that her voice might be good enough to avoid embarrassment. She walks onto the stage terrified, wearing a dress that doesn't fit properly and shoes that have seen too many miles of Harlem streets. The audience is restless, skeptical. This nervous teenager doesn't look like star material, doesn't project the confidence and glamour they associate with professional entertainment. For a moment, Ella stands frozen, overwhelmed by the lights and the expectations and the fear that she's about to humiliate herself in front of hundreds of people. Then she begins to sing Judy and The Object of My Affection, is in songs she's heard on the radio and practiced quietly to herself during the long, homeless nights. Her voice, still developing but already showing signs of the crystal clarity and perfect pitch that will define her career, cuts through the skeptical murmur of the crowd. By the time she reaches the chorus, the theater is completely silent, absorbed in sounds they've never heard from someone so young, so uncertain, so obviously unrehearsed. She wins first prize, but more importantly, she catches the attention of Bardu Ali, the master of ceremonies, who recognizes something special in this terrified girl with the extraordinary voice. Ali connects her with bandleader Chick Webb, who needs a female vocalist for his orchestra, and is willing to take a chance on someone with raw talent and desperate hunger for success. Could anyone have predicted what would follow? Could anyone have known that this moment of spontaneous terror would produce one of the most celebrated voices in American music history? Or that the girl who chose singing over dancing because she was afraid of humiliation would spend the next 60 years proving that sometimes the most beautiful art comes from the most vulnerable moments? Chick Webb's decision to hire 17-year-old Ella Fitzgerald is part artistic instinct, part humanitarian gesture, part recognition of a shared understanding about being underestimated. Webb, a diminutive drummer whose physical limitations never hindered his musical genius, sees in Ella something beyond raw talent. He recognizes the particular hunger that comes from having nowhere else to go, the desperate need to transform survival into art. But Webb becomes more than just Ella's employer. He becomes the father figure she lost when William Fitzgerald disappeared from her life. Webb understands that developing Ella's talent requires more than musical education. It requires healing the psychological wounds that homelessness and abandonment have created. He treats her not just as a vocalist, but as a daughter. providing the stability, guidance, and unconditional support that her chaotic childhood never offered. Under Webb's paternal protection, Ella begins to trust that good things can last, that she doesn't have to be afraid of every success being temporary. He teaches her not just how to phrase lyrics and work with arrangements, but how to believe she deserves the opportunities her talent creates. When she stands rigid behind the microphone, terrified of making mistakes, Webb doesn't just coach her technique. He coaches her confidence, showing her that the stage can be a home rather than a place of judgment. She's got everything except the belief that she belongs here, Webb tells his band members. Our job is to make her feel like family until she stops expecting to be thrown out. It's precisely the kind of patient, unconditional love that Ella has never experienced, the understanding that she needs emotional healing as much as artistic development. When Webb dies suddenly in 1939, Ella doesn't just lose her mentor and employer, she loses the only father she's ever really known. The grief is devastating precisely because Webb had given her something she'd never had. The security of being loved not for what she could provide, but for who she was. His death reactivates all her childhood fears about abandonment, about the temporary nature of good things, about her fundamental inability to keep the people she loves. More challengingly, they have to help her overcome the crippling shyness that threatens to undermine her performing ability. Ella's voice is magnificent, but her stage presence initially borders on invisible. She stands rigid behind the microphone, eyes closed or staring at the floor, as if she's singing for herself rather than for the audience. The confidence and charisma that seem to come naturally to other performers remain foreign concepts to someone whose entire life experience has taught her to avoid rather than seek attention. Webb addresses this problem with patience and strategic thinking that reveal his own understanding of performance as psychological as well as musical. He arranges for Ella to start with songs that make her comfortable, standards she's familiar with rather than the complex arrangements that showcase the band's sophistication. He positions her physically in ways that minimize her self-consciousness, gradually building her confidence through small successes rather than overwhelming her with expectations she can't meet. The transformation is gradual but undeniable. As Ella becomes more comfortable with the technical aspects of professional singing, her natural musicality begins to emerge more fully. She develops the ability to improvise, to take familiar songs and make them uniquely hers through subtle changes in phrasing, rhythm, vocal coloring. Most importantly, she learns to use her voice as a conversational instrument, to make audiences feel like she's singing directly to them rather than performing at them. By 1935, just a year after her Apollo Theater debut, Ella has become an integral part of Webb's organization and is beginning to attract attention beyond Harlem's music scene. Jazz critics notice her unusual combination of technical precision and emotional authenticity, the way she can execute complex vocal runs while maintaining the storytelling quality that makes songs memorable rather than just impressive. She's developing the signature style that will define her career, crystalline clarity combined with interpretive intelligence, technical perfection balanced with emotional accessibility. But it's the recording of A Tasket in 1938 that transforms Ella from promising young singer to national sensation. The song, based on a nursery rhyme she remembered from childhood, becomes an unexpected hit that establishes her as more than just another band vocalist. The playful, swinging arrangement showcases both her technical ability and her personality, proving that she can be both sophisticated and approachable, both musically complex and immediately appealing. The success of A Tasket changes everything for Ella, but change brings new pressures and challenges that she's not entirely prepared to handle. Suddenly, she's not just Chick Webb's vocalist, but a recording star in her own right, someone whose name appears on marquees and whose photograph appears in magazines. The shy teenager who entered the Apollo Theater competition to avoid starvation is now expected to be a public personality, someone who can handle interviews and photo shoots and all the promotional activities that commercial success requires. The attention is both wonderful and overwhelming. For someone who spent her formative years feeling invisible and unwanted, being celebrated and desired feels like a fantasy come to life. But Ella also discovers that fame doesn't automatically solve the psychological wounds left by childhood abandonment and homelessness, that success can actually amplify feelings of insecurity by raising the stakes of potential failure. When Chick Webb dies suddenly in 1939, Ella faces the first major professional crisis of her career. Webb had been more than just her employer. He'd been her mentor, protector, the person who gave her a place in the world when she had nowhere else to go. His death forces her to decide whether she's ready to lead the band herself or whether she needs to find a new musical home with someone else's organization. She chooses to take over leadership of the band, renaming it Ella Fitzgerald and her famous orchestra. The decision requires tremendous courage from someone who still struggles with self-confidence, but it also represents a crucial step in her artistic development. As a band leader, she can't hide behind other people's arrangements and musical decisions. She has to develop her own artistic vision, make choices about material and presentation that reflect her own musical sensibilities. The experience of leading the band teaches Ella skills that will serve her throughout her career: how to manage professional relationships, how to balance artistic integrity with commercial viability, how to be both a collaborator and a leader. More importantly, it forces her to develop confidence in her own musical instincts, to trust that the shy girl from Harlem has something valuable to contribute to America's musical conversation. By the early 1940s, Ella has established herself as one of the premier vocalists in American jazz, but she's also reached a plateau where further growth requires artistic risks that she's not sure she's ready to take. The swing era that launched her career is evolving into bebop, a more complex and challenging form of jazz that demands different technical and interpretive skills. Some established performers resist these changes, preferring to continue working in familiar styles rather than adapting to new musical demands. Ella chooses adaptation, working with bebop pioneers like Dizzy Gillespie and developing the scat singing technique that will become one of her most distinctive contributions to jazz vocal style. Scat singing, improvising with nonsense syllables rather than lyrics, allows her to use her voice like a horn to participate in the rapid-fire musical conversations that define bebop while showcasing her extraordinary range and precision. But mastering bebop requires more than just technical skill. It requires a level of musical confidence that Ella has to consciously develop. Bebop is music for musicians, complex and demanding in ways that can intimidate performers who are more comfortable with the accessible swing arrangements that made them famous. Ella's willingness to embrace this challenge demonstrates not just artistic ambition but personal growth. The evolution from someone who sings because it's the only thing that makes sense to someone who understands herself as a serious artistic interpreter. The decade of the 1940s establishes Ella as more than just a successful performer. She becomes a musical innovator whose approach to vocal jazz influences an entire generation of singers. Her collaboration with bebop musicians proves that vocal music can be as sophisticated and challenging as instrumental jazz, while remaining emotionally accessible to audiences who might find pure instrumental bebop intimidating or alienating. But professional success doesn't automatically translate into personal fulfillment, and Ella discovers that being celebrated as an artist doesn't necessarily solve the fundamental loneliness that has shaped her emotional life since childhood. The girl who learned to find safety through performance continues to struggle with authentic intimacy, with allowing people to know her as something other than the magnificent voice that defines her public identity. This tension between public success and private emptiness becomes the central challenge of Ella's middle career, the period when she achieves everything she thought she wanted, and discovers that achievement itself can be another form of isolation, another way of being alone in a crowded room, another stage where she performs rather than simply exists. The 1950s mark Ella's transformation from successful jazz singer to American cultural institution. Her decision to record the Songbook series, comprehensive interpretations of the work of major American composers like Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, and Duke Ellington, establishes her as something more than just a jazz vocalist. She becomes the definitive interpreter of American popular song, the voice that transforms Broadway standards into enduring art. The Songbook recordings represent the apex of Ella's artistic achievement, combining her technical mastery with mature interpretive intelligence. Each album is a masterclass in vocal interpretation, demonstrating how the same song can convey different emotions depending on subtle changes in phrasing, rhythm, and vocal coloring. More than just collections of songs, these recordings become cultural artifacts that preserve and celebrate American musical composition at its finest. Working with arrangers like Nelson Riddle and Paul Weston, Ella approaches each composer's catalog with the respect of a musical scholar and the interpretive freedom of a creative artist. She doesn't just sing these songs, she inhabits them, finding emotional truths in familiar lyrics that previous performers missed or ignored. Her version of Summertime becomes the definitive interpretation of Gershwin's masterpiece. Her recording of Cole Porter's sophisticated wordplay makes complex lyrics seem effortless and natural. But the Songbook series also represents something more personal for Ella: the transformation of her childhood insecurity into mature artistic confidence. The shy teenager who once stood frozen on the Apollo Theater stage has become someone who can take on the most sophisticated American songs and make them uniquely hers. The orphan who learned to survive by making herself useful has become someone whose usefulness transcends mere entertainment. She's preserving and transmitting cultural treasures that might otherwise be forgotten. The critical and commercial success of the Songbook recordings brings Ella to the attention of audiences who might never have discovered her through jazz channels alone. She appears on television variety shows, performs at prestigious venues like Carnegie Hall, tours internationally as a cultural ambassador representing American music at its finest. The girl who once slept in Harlem doorways now stays in luxury hotels and performs for heads of state. But success at this level brings new forms of isolation and pressure. Ella discovers that being treated as a cultural treasure can be as lonely as being ignored. That reverence from audiences doesn't necessarily translate into genuine human connection. The very qualities that make her such a compelling performer, her ability to find emotional truth in songs, her gift for making audiences feel understood, become barriers to authentic intimacy in her personal relationships. Her marriage to bassist Ray Brown in 1947 represents an attempt to build the kind of stable, loving relationship that her chaotic childhood never provided. Brown is not just a romantic partner, but a musical collaborator, someone who understands the demands and rewards of professional music making. Their partnership promises to combine personal happiness with artistic fulfillment, the possibility of sharing both life and art with someone who truly understands both. But the relationship faces pressures that neither of them fully anticipates. Both Ella and Ray are at the peaks of their respective careers, which means constant travel, conflicting schedules, the challenge of building intimacy when professional obligations keep them apart more often than they're together. More fundamentally, Ella's lifelong pattern of expressing herself through performance rather than direct communication creates emotional distance even when they're physically present with each other. The marriage produces a son, Ray Jr., whom they adopt, giving Ella the opportunity to provide the kind of stable, loving childhood that she never experienced. But motherhood, like marriage, proves more complex than Ella anticipated. Her own childhood experiences provide few positive models for parenting, while her professional obligations limit the time and energy she can devote to child rearing. She wants to be a better mother than she had, but she's not sure how to balance that desire with the career that gives her life meaning and provides financial security. The marriage to Ray Brown ends in divorce in 1953, another loss that reinforces Ella's deepest fears about her ability to maintain lasting relationships. The failure feels particularly devastating because Ray understood her musical ambitions, supported her artistic development, seemed like someone who could love both Ella the person and Ella the performer. If she can't make it work with someone who shares her deepest passions, how can she ever find lasting love? The divorce coincides with the period when Ella is achieving her greatest artistic and commercial success, creating a painful contrast between her public triumphs and private failures. Audiences see her as the embodiment of musical joy and sophistication, but privately she struggles with depression and loneliness that success can't alleviate. The voice that brings happiness to millions becomes the source of personal isolation for the woman who possesses it. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, as Ella becomes established as the First Lady of Song, she also becomes increasingly aware of the limitations that racism imposes on even the most successful African-American performers. Despite her international acclaim and artistic achievements, she faces constant discrimination when touring, especially in the South. Hotels refuse her reservations. Restaurants deny her service. Venues that book her performances sometimes require her to enter through service doors rather than main entrances. The contrast between her artistic stature and her treatment as a second-class citizen creates a particular kind of psychological pressure. On stage, she's treated with reverence, celebrated as one of America's greatest artists. Off stage, she's subjected to the same humiliations as any other African American, regardless of her fame or achievements. The disconnect between these experiences is both absurd and deeply painful, a constant reminder that artistic excellence doesn't immunize anyone against systemic racism. Frank Sinatra's intervention on her behalf becomes one of the most significant gestures of support in her career. When the prestigious Mocambo nightclub in West Hollywood initially refuses to book her, Sinatra promises to attend her performances and bring his entourage if the club changes its policy. His support helps break down barriers not just for Ella but for other African-American performers, demonstrating how artistic solidarity can be a form of civil rights advocacy. But even well-intentioned support from white colleagues can't entirely solve the fundamental problem: that Ella's extraordinary talent has made her a symbol of American cultural achievement, while American society continues to treat her as inferior based on her race. The psychological toll of this contradiction contributes to the depression and social withdrawal that characterizes much of her later career. As the 1960s progress, Ella's voice begins to show subtle signs of the wear that decades of constant performing inevitably create. The crystal clarity remains, but she has to work harder to maintain the effortless quality that once came naturally. More troubling, she begins to experience health problems that threaten not just her comfort but her ability to perform. Diabetes, heart trouble, circulatory issues that make the constant travel required by her career increasingly difficult. The diagnosis of diabetes in particular represents a turning point in Ella's relationship with her own body and her career. The disease requires careful management of diet, medication, and stress levels, all challenges for someone whose professional life involves irregular schedules, constant travel, and the physical demands of regular performance. More frightening, diabetes can affect eyesight, circulation, and overall energy levels in ways that directly threaten a performer's ability to maintain professional standards. Ella responds to these health challenges with the same determination that has characterized her entire career, modifying her lifestyle and performance schedule to accommodate medical necessities while refusing to retire or significantly reduce her artistic activities. She understands intuitively that singing isn't just her profession but her reason for being, that the only thing that made sense can't be abandoned simply because it's become more difficult. But the health problems also force her to confront questions about legacy and mortality that she's avoided throughout her career. What will happen to the music she spent decades perfecting? How can she ensure that the interpretive insights she's developed survive her own physical decline? Who will carry on the tradition of sophisticated vocal jazz that she's helped create? These questions become more urgent as the musical landscape changes around her. The 1960s and 1970s bring rock and roll, soul, and other forms of popular music that appeal to younger audiences but have little connection to the jazz and standards tradition that defines Ella's artistry. She remains popular with established audiences, but she's increasingly seen as a representative of an earlier era rather than a contemporary artist. The generational shift in popular music creates professional challenges. Fewer bookings, smaller audiences, reduced recording opportunities, but it also provides a form of liberation. As Ella becomes less concerned with commercial viability, she can focus more completely on artistic fulfillment, on exploring the depths of songs and styles that have sustained her throughout her career. The pressure to stay current diminishes, replaced by the freedom to perfect and transmit the musical traditions she's mastered. During the 1980s, as Ella enters her final decade of regular performing, her concerts take on the quality of cultural events rather than simple entertainment. Audiences come not just to hear great singing, but to witness living musical history, to connect with artistic traditions that seem increasingly remote from contemporary culture. Ella herself seems to understand this role, approaching her performances with a sense of responsibility to preserve and transmit cultural treasures that might otherwise be lost. But the physical demands of performance become increasingly difficult as her health problems worsen. The diabetes that she's managed for decades begins to cause serious complications, vision problems that make it difficult to read lyrics, circulation issues that affect her stamina, neuropathy that makes standing for extended periods painful. Each performance becomes a triumph of determination over physical limitation, will over medical reality. In 1986, Ella undergoes heart bypass surgery, a major procedure that forces her to take an extended break from performing for the first time in her adult life. The recovery period allows her to rest, but also confronts her with the silence she spent decades avoiding. The quiet space where she has to exist as simply Ella, rather than Ella Fitzgerald, the performer. The experience is both healing and terrifying, reminding her of how much of her identity has been built around the act of singing rather than the person doing the singing. When she returns to performing after her recovery, both she and her audiences understand that these concerts are precious, limited, not to be taken for granted. Her voice retains its essential beauty but shows clear signs of age and wear. More significantly, her physical presence on stage becomes more fragile, requiring careful management of lighting, seating, and performance duration to accommodate her medical limitations. The early 1990s marked the beginning of Ella's final decline, as diabetes complications become too severe to ignore or work around. In 1993, she undergoes the amputation of both legs below the knees, a devastating blow for someone whose sense of self has been built around performance and movement. The surgery is necessary to prevent life-threatening infections, but it effectively ends her ability to appear in public or maintain the kind of active performance schedule that has defined her entire adult life. The loss of her legs represents more than just a physical limitation. It forces Ella to confront the reality that her performing career is over, that the thing that has given her life meaning and structure for 60 years is no longer possible. The woman who once said, "I sang because it was the only thing that made sense," has to find new ways to make sense of existence without the ability to sing professionally. Her final years are spent in relative seclusion, cared for by devoted friends and medical professionals, but increasingly isolated from the music world that was her true home. The diabetes that claimed her legs also begins to affect her eyesight and her voice, gradually stripping away the abilities that made her unique. By 1995, she can no longer see clearly enough to read music or lyrics, and her voice, while still recognizably hers, lacks the power and precision that once made it one of the most celebrated instruments in American music. The woman who gave everything to the music discovers in her final years that the music can't give back the things that matter most: health, companionship, the basic physical comforts that make life bearable. She faces a cruel irony that many great performers confront, that the very dedication that made their art possible can leave them isolated and vulnerable when they can no longer perform. "I gave everything to the music," she tells a friend during this final period, "but I'm not sure it ever gave back." The statement captures both the nobility and the tragedy of her career, that she achieved artistic immortality while sacrificing much of what makes life worth living, that she became First Lady of Song while remaining in many ways a lonely orphan searching for a home she could never quite find. On June 15, 1996, Ella Fitzgerald dies quietly in her Beverly Hills home, surrounded by caregivers but far from the stages where she achieved greatness. Her death receives appropriate coverage in newspapers and magazines, obituaries that celebrate her artistic achievements and cultural significance. But the coverage can't capture the essential sadness of her final years. That the woman who made millions of people feel less lonely through her singing died feeling profoundly isolated, that the voice that brought joy to the world couldn't ultimately bring lasting happiness to the woman who possessed it. The funeral draws hundreds of mourners from the music world and beyond, but it also highlights how few people truly knew Ella as something other than a performer. The tributes celebrate her artistic legacy, and rightfully so, but they also reveal how successfully she maintained the privacy that both protected and isolated her throughout her life. In the years following her death, Ella's influence on American music becomes even more apparent as newer generations discover her recordings and recognize the standard she set for vocal jazz interpretation. Her technique becomes required study for serious jazz vocalists. Her interpretations of American standards remain definitive decades after they were recorded. The songbook series continues to serve as both entertainment and education, introducing listeners to the sophisticated songwriting tradition that she preserved and transmitted. But perhaps Ella's most important legacy is more subtle, the proof that extraordinary art can emerge from the most disadvantaged circumstances. That talent combined with determination can transcend social barriers, that someone who begins life as unwanted and homeless can become essential to their culture's understanding of itself. Her story demonstrates both the possibility and the cost of such transformation, the way that achieving greatness can require sacrificing the ordinary pleasures that make life worth living. The girl who chose singing over dancing because she was afraid of failing at the Apollo Theater became the woman who defined success in American vocal music. The orphan who learned that survival required making herself useful became the artist who made herself indispensable to her nation's cultural heritage. The shy teenager who stood frozen on stage became the confident interpreter who could make any song uniquely her own. But she also remained in many ways the frightened girl who sang because it was the only thing that made sense in a senseless world. The success that should have provided security instead created new forms of vulnerability. The fame that should have brought love instead brought isolation. The voice that should have been her salvation became in some ways her prison. The thing that defined her so completely that she could never quite escape it to discover who she might have been without it. The girl who chose singing over dancing because she was afraid of failing at the Apollo Theater became the woman who defined success in American vocal music. The orphan who learned that survival required making herself useful became the artist who made herself indispensable to her nation's cultural heritage. The shy teenager who stood frozen on stage became the confident interpreter who could make any song uniquely her own. But she also remained in many ways the frightened girl who sang because it was the only thing that made sense in a senseless world. Until even that was taken from her. The success that should have provided security instead created new forms of vulnerability. The fame that should have brought love instead brought isolation. The voice that should have been her salvation became, in some ways, her prison. The thing that defined her so completely that she could never quite escape it to discover who she might have been without it. Ella Fitzgerald made the entire world feel less lonely, except for herself. She spent her life filling other people's silence with songs about love and joy and connection. But she could never quite fill the silence in her own heart. The space left empty by childhood abandonment and reinforced by a lifetime of performing for others rather than living for herself. Her voice remains perfect in our memories, crystal clear and emotionally true, unmarked by the pain and loneliness that shadowed her personal life. In that perfection lies both her triumph and her tragedy. She succeeded so completely in transforming her suffering into beauty that we sometimes forget the suffering was real. That the First Lady of Song was also an orphan who never quite found her way home. The only thing better than singing, she said, was more singing. But more singing couldn't fill the silence between songs, couldn't heal the wounds that predated the music, couldn't provide the human connection that even the most perfect voice needs to sustain itself. In the end, Ella discovered that you can perfect the art of making others feel loved while never learning how to feel loved yourself. She gave everything to the music, but the music, magnificent as it was, couldn't give back the things that mattered most. Belonging, connection, the simple human comfort of being cherished for who you are rather than what you can do. The voice that reached everyone could never quite reach the lonely girl inside who needed saving most of all. Ella Fitzgerald, the woman who made loneliness beautiful for everyone except the person who felt it most deeply. The First Lady who reigned over American song while remaining in her deepest heart, the orphan girl who sang because it was the only thing that made sense, even when nothing else in her life ever quite did. What does it matter if your voice lives forever when your heart still dies in silence? What good is immortality through song when the singer herself feels forgotten by love? These are the questions Ella's legacy poses. Not answers, but the eternal mystery of an artist who gave the world everything she had, and still felt like it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness that created the need to sing in the first place. The First Lady of Song has been silent for over 25 years now, but her voice continues to comfort strangers. While the woman who created that comfort remains, even in memory, essentially alone. Proof that the greatest artists often pay the highest prices for their gifts, and that sometimes the most beautiful sounds emerge from the deepest, most inconsolable silence.